Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar. This is the first of a series that the EUA is organising on the Bologna process. We're looking at different aspects of areas of work in Bologna, such as internationalisation, digitalisation, flexible learning, social dimension, and others. With the next Bologna Ministerial Meeting taking place in Rome on the 18th to 20th of November, it's really timely to shed some light on several topics closely related to universities and their current policies and practice, and to think about what the added value is that is brought by the Bologna process and how it might change. Our first webinar is this one, Closing the Gap, the Bologna process and higher education institutions. And it will look at horizon scanning from a variety of different perspectives from institutions and countries. And we'll think about how the Bologna process has impacted on higher education. We'll also look at what the possibilities are for the future. Our seminars co-organised by Universities UK, the Flemish Inter-University Council and the European University Association. Can I just quickly tell you some technical information? Firstly, we're recording this and the recording will be available on the EUA YouTube channel. Now, there's going to be around 400 to 500 participants on the webinar, which is a lot of people, but we're hoping to make it feel interactive. First of all, there's a chat box, but that is for very technical questions. More importantly, perhaps, there's the Q&A box, and that's any question that you might have for speakers. And this box is moderated by one of the team. So you can, raise issues that you'd like to be discussed, and then we're going to look at the questions and see what the recurring themes are. Thirdly, we're going to have a few live poll questions that will be featured during the webinar, which is really to take the temperature of opinion amongst the people watching. Okay, that's all the technical information. So can I introduce, maybe I should just introduce myself. I'm Ella Ritchie and I am the moderator of the webinar. Our speakers are Miguel Gable, who is Director at the EUA's Higher Education Policy Unit. Marita Hilliget, who is the Secretary General for the Swedish National Rectors Conference, the Association of Swedish HE Institutions. And Peter Levens, who is Vice Rector for International Policy at the Catholic University in Leuven, Belgium. So, can I hand over to our first speaker, which is Michael.
Well, thank you, Ella, and good afternoon, everybody. And thanks for the opportunity to address you here this afternoon on this important topic. I titled my presentation, Achievements, Challenges and Changes in the Bologna Process. And I think that's what probably is what one has to understand when one talks about filling the gap in the between the Bologna process and the higher education institutions. I think that has been a discussion that has been up for quite a while, and what I will try to do here in the next minutes is to give you my reflection on this topic from somebody who knows both sides, so to say, as I'm representing the universities in the Bologna process, and I'm a participant and an active member of the Bologna follow-up group, but also looking at it from an institutional perspective. And while doing that, I will also try to provide you some ideas on how it could be changed and how that could be better developed in the future. And on the way also point to some of the achievements, some of the progress that the process has made recently, and also on some of the things where we didn't progress as we had actually expected. Just for those of you who may not know about the Bologna process or may have forgotten it, so it started in 98, 99, with the goal to make European higher education systems more compatible, to have more exchange and mobility among each other, but also to enhance the quality and the international attractiveness. It is an intergovernmental process in essence, started with 4 governments at the time, and by now it's 48 governments and the European Commission. Another government, San Marino, is expected to join in November at the ministerial conference. What is important is that there are also the consultative members in the process, that is the EUA, so my organization, but also representatives of university colleges, students, staff unions, Education International, QA agencies, and also the Council of Europe. So that is important because the process from the beginning was set to take place in partnership, driven in partnership by ministers and sector organizations. It is actually a very light organization, so to say. It has only one permanent structure, which is the European Quality Assurance Register, ECHA. And everything else is basically provided by the participating parties. So there's always one government hosting the secretariat and also providing the ministerial conference then after 2 or 3 years. And then there's a communique issued which tells you about progress made and plans for the future. So that's it in a nutshell. I think I don't have to read out the list of topics that stand for Bologna: quality assurance, recognition, 3-cycle, mobility, and you know them all from your institutional or organizational practice. They have been there for quite some time. And I think throughout 2010, that was actually the visit card of the Bologna process. This is what people understood when you said Bologna. And actually, the idea was to get all this done by 2010, to announce the European higher education area, and then probably close the process. But when it came to 2010, we announced the higher education area, but we also found good reasons to continue the process. And one of them was unfinished business, as it said at the time. And this gets us right into the work of the Bologna process and how it actually brings things forward and makes progress. And I think mobility was probably one of the early things where we found out that there are actually some good goals, but insufficient follow-up. Mobility has been reiterated in all communiques again and again. But around 2008-9, we started asking us, are we actually making any progress? And how do we know? As there was no real data on mobility. So 2 things happened then. Data collection was started, which turned out to be very challenging. And at the same time, we set out a benchmark, 20% of graduates by 2020. Now we have 2020 now. And when you look into the Bologna Process Implementation Report, which will come out in November, you find out that we underachieved. It's not even half of what we had committed to. And I think that's an important point. At least we know that, yeah, without the benchmark, we wouldn't have known. Without the process, we wouldn't have known. And what you can also learn from the report is that it was important to set the benchmark, because if not, the results would be even worse. So it's clearly said there that it helped to push credit mobility in particular, but put awareness for enhancing mobility in general. I can tell you now a similar story on the social dimension, which was on the agenda ever since the process started. And there have been several attempts to improve it, but we have never really seen any coordinated follow-up on that, apart from what some individual member states did. Now, when you look into the 2020 communique that comes out in November, you will find that there's a reference made to principles and guidelines to strengthen the social dimension. Now, you know already principles and guidelines from quality assurance, but this is a different set now, and which really tries to make some pointers of what national authorities should look at when trying to enhance social inclusion, equity, and access. I quote here one principle, I think, which I found particularly important, and which also is kind of telling for the direction that the process seems to start to take. And that is namely that it says public authorities should engage in policy dialogue with higher education institutions and other relevant stakeholders. So this is no longer, as it was probably the first 10 or 15 years, about top-down implementation of ministerial reforms, but it is really about working together with the sector. I'm looking forward to 2024 when we have the next report to find out what has really happened there. One issue that struck around 2015-16, that even on issues that were core to Bologna, like recognition, the 3 study cycles, quality assurance, we had seen a lot of progress, but it was also very uneven. Some countries did this very well, others seemed to do it less well. And this gave reasons then for the ministers in the BFUG to agree on launching a peer learning approach. And interestingly, this was somebody that has been borrowed from the sector, actually from my own organization. We were running thematic peer learning groups for a while, and some colleagues from governments had looked into that and found that was a good idea also for working among ministries and involving stakeholders. And this has been going on in a first round for the past 2 years. We think it has been very successful, but I mean, it will take some time to assess the impact. So basically that is so that countries can support each other, those who are doing well, help those who are a bit struggling with the issues. A few more points. I think it became increasingly clear that the higher education sector, students, staff, university leadership were actually dealing with issues which were not getting much discussion, which were not really discussed at the Bologna follow-up group level and in the Bologna process. And this was in particular learning and teaching and digitalization. And again, here in 2018, in the communique, you find then the statement that cooperation in innovative learning and teaching practices should become another hallmark of the higher education area. And in the 2020 communique now in the autumn, there will be the launch of recommendations for national authorities. Have a look at them. You might find them not too daring or too ambitious, but actually it's the first consensus that we had on them, where really a working group looked on not what ministers thought should happen, but rather what is actually happening in the different higher education systems. What are the good practices? What works at national level? What works at institutions? And tried to formulate this as recommendations then for the Bologna process. Again, we will see how the follow-up on this will be. Likewise, there has been, since the start of the process, always reference being made to academic freedom, autonomy, higher education as a public responsibility, and we all had, I think, instinctively hoped that the situation would get better and we would in the future not face problems on these issues. But the reality shows us that this is not the case, and we probably have rather more than less infringement of these, as we call them, fundamental values. This is why in the past 2 years there has been a small group working on this issue, and this will start now in a larger group which will work on fundamental values to foster constructive dialogue and peer learning on the issue, and also have some monitoring so that in 3-4 years we can point out much clearer than we can nowadays what are the shortcomings, what has to be improved. Okay. And I'm sure, yeah, we will find something in about every system. So just to say, and probably I skip that part here and come to an end, just to point some of the changes that we have seen in the Bologna process. There has been a shift from our governmental reforms only to transformation through support for the sector. This is what you find in many of the paragraphs of the upcoming communique. It's no longer the ministers which decided and will do something, but they will support the higher education institutions and the stakeholders, which I think is very important. I pointed to the changes in the working methods, peer learning, and there are also joint projects. And I think the experimentation is just starting. So there is more opportunity for more participatory approaches. Important probably also for you to know that the process is overall much more transparent. So if you go on the website, you will find all the documents of the meetings there, and you can see them already now. And I think what is important that we realize that the process is quite resilient and continuous, unlike many other international processes. It hasn't stopped with the COVID-19 crisis, but the work has basically, without a break, continued. And as the process will be there at least until 2030, maybe even longer, it's probably worth asking what could actually be improved in the process. And I think that should be discussed in the ministries and by the governments, but it's also worth a discussion for the higher education sector. So what can we proactively bring in, as I think the process is much more open also for bottom-up approaches. I think with this, I'm closing. I just want to highlight the 19th November Bologna Ministerial Conference. It's, as many things in these days, it's a bit special as it will take place online. That has the advantage that it is likely to become fully web streamed, so you can actually all participate in the conference. And yeah, the rest is written out there. So the communique, I mentioned that already. There will be a Bologna Process implementation report, and then we set out a new work program together with the Albanian Secretariat. So that's from my side as an introduction. I'm looking forward to your questions and also to see the take up from my colleagues from Sweden and Flanders. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Miguel. Just to say to everyone, the questions will come after we've heard all three speakers. So thank you for that very honest look at the Bologna process. Could I ask Marita now, please, to give her presentation?
Thank you, Ella, and good afternoon from a kitchen in Stockholm. I'm very happy to be with you today. Let's see if I can get my presentation up. Is it there?
It was up and went down again, so you had it up already.
Yeah, I'll try to get it up again. Okay, thank you. The ideas with the Bologna process, the principles and the goals have from the very beginning been embraced in Sweden. You see several of them on this slide. Building a European higher education era through more compatible higher education structures, a mutual trust through quality assurance were never controversial. Many of the ideas here have not, however, by the Swedish higher education institutions been attributed to the Bologna process. For example, students' participation in governance structures have been codified in the legislation for a long time. Credit systems as a way to describe the amount of learning was used long before Bologna in Sweden. For several years, we honored the ideas, but didn't do much, since we thought we already had it in place. One of the more experienced Swedish rectors that worked as a Bologna expert during the early years of the process, Eva Åkesson at Uppsala University, described Sweden as the sleeping beauty. However, finally, we understood that also we had a lot to do, and we did. The presenters today have been asked to provide you with examples where the Bologna process made an impact on our institutions, and I will give two. First, the clarification of the structure of the system revealed unharvested potentials to develop the second cycle in our system, and it was done. Hundreds of master level programs in English were created. And this was the basis to a very successful development of the internationalization for the institutions. Secondly, we entered a long and sometimes painful journey where the Swedish higher education institutions made a major effort to decide what kind of quality assurance system would be long-term beneficial, and then convince all stakeholders, including a highly reluctant government, that such system must be developed. The Bologna process ideas and the ESG instrument in the steadfast hands of ENCA were instrumental to achieve this. This journey has resulted in higher education institutions with a clear and deeply rooted ownership of their quality development, of their development. So, how are the institutions involved in the ongoing Bologna process in Sweden? The Swedish Rectors Conference is invited to give input to every step of preparing for the ministerial conferences and the work of the Bologna follow-up group. That is good. Another good thing is that we are not the only invited organization. To the same table, 2 higher education authorities and the Swedish Students' Union and the Swedish Association of University Teachers and Researchers, the union of the academic staff, are invited. And I won't tell you who is the fox or the beautiful green frog. During these consultation meetings, I have learned a lot, and I believe it's very fruitful for all of us, including the ministry. We can see it from different perspectives, and together we have a broader knowledge base, although we do not always agree on everything. It is my opinion that we are being listened to. My second point is that Bologna process is a voluntary agreement between governments, and we like that. And with its downsides, we want to keep it that way. It gives room for the necessary autonomy to solve things with respect to each country's situation. However, it has its consequences. The agreements are subject to sometimes complicated negotiations between countries and also within a country. The Swedish ministers cannot make any decisions on their own. They decide as one government. That coordination and decision machinery takes time, making it a major challenge to include the institutions more in the policy part of the process. Last time, we had only 15 hours to prepare for the consultation meeting. I would like to conclude that in a, for us, typical blue-eyed way, we have from the very beginning thought that although practitioners, students, and sometimes even the higher education leaders do not talk so much about the term Bologna process, we live it, and perhaps even more so today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I hand over to Peter now?
Peter, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. Very sorry. Usual mistake. Thank you, Ella, for passing the floor. I would like to continue with a couple of statements on the Bologna process in Flanders, how it has developed and what we feel about this now. And I will do this by starting to refer to the complexity of what we typically are dealing with when we are talking about the issues that are core to the Bologna process. Not only at European level, we have the European higher education area and all the instruments that are coming up. In Belgium, we have different communities. We have councils that bring together universities, Flemish universities, but also the universities of applied sciences and arts. And then there are overarching structures, and I do forget a couple of them. And then on top of them, on top of these regional, national, European organizations, we all are very, very much attached to our networks. And this has been amplified the last couple of years by the initiative of European universities. So we are living in a very complex world. And in this world, I think it's a blessing that something like the Bologna process has happened and is still happening, actually. I won't repeat what my colleagues have just said in the interventions before. So I won't really go into the details of how Flanders has dealt with the various aspects put forward 20 years ago within the Bologna process. I think we have done quite well with lots of achievements moving towards the goals that were set forward. And actually quite important for that has been the fact that early on in the process, in consultation with the overarching bodies of universities and university colleges, the government really has taken initiative to implement decrees that have forced us actually to make changes. At that time, probably this was a lot of effort and not everybody was very pleased, but now we certainly are very happy with what happened. And that, I think, brought us up to speed to enhance collaboration at the international level, to improve mobility numbers and so on. Quite important though is, and I think this is something that we should keep in mind all the time when trying to organize processes at a regulatory level, is that the main responsibility of the higher education enterprise on curricula, on content, on quality assurance stays and has to stay with the higher education institutions. I think this is something that we all should value a lot. So where are we now then? Trying to move my slide. The question that we have been posing ourselves is what at this moment the reputation of the Bologna process is. I'm quite sure that, and this is quite different than maybe 10 years ago, the average teacher or professor or student is not really very much aware of what typically is happening nowadays on the Bologna process. So if you would ask me and many of the colleagues at my institution at KU Leuven, I'm not sure if there would be lots of enthusiasm to continue with business as usual in the way the Bologna process has been organized. That being said, most of us are convinced that European collaboration in higher education is more needed than ever. And there are several ways of doing that. One initiative taken by the European Commission has been the initiative of European University Alliance. We are a member of one of those, Una Europa. And well, many of the aspects that are laid out there are reinforcing aspects of what the Bologna process has meant to us. That being said, I think it would be good to reinvent parts of the aspects that the Bologna process is doing, and maybe this could be done with a double reflection. One is, and that has been mentioned by the speakers before, is to try to fully realize all the early ambitions that have been around now for 20 years, because we notice quite often that we are not there yet, in particular when we are setting up innovative ways of collaborating within university networks. We find boundaries, we are confronted with some limitations. And then maybe a second aspect to prioritize certain aspects, certain issues, I would say is that there could maybe be an emphasis on societal needs, and I'll give you one example of that also. So let me just briefly reflect, because it was already mentioned by Michael, that in 2009, actually in Leuven and Louvain-la-Neuve, there was this quite interesting statement on inclusion and equitable access and completion of study. I think this is really still very important to realize in the current context, and I think if we make the analysis of numbers, of figures, of progress in that regard, we must come to the conclusion that we are not there yet. The student body within higher education should reflect the diversity of Europe's populations. I don't think we have reached that so far, so I would plead to invest a lot along that line for the next phase of the Bologna process. And then another example that I would like to give relates to the European degree. For instance, within the European University Alliances, we are aiming to work together very closely and are constantly confronted with different legislations, with complexities when realizing joint efforts in awarding degrees. What we really would like is that within all these instruments that aim for lots of flexibility and a multi-campus inter-university approach with very specific adapted formats of mobility, that there is at the national level some efforts taken to facilitate these endeavors, for instance, by lifting some legal restrictions that may still be there, to make sure that accreditation agencies and the accreditation and quality assurance process is well aligned, and that we also work on the timelines that sometimes are quite different in different countries, making it quite time consuming. And then I'm talking about many years to really take new initiatives. With that, I come to the conclusion, and I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much. We're now turning to the first live poll, which someone will get on the screen. Okay, so this is how the Bologna process has influenced practice in your institution. So you've got a number of options there, and you should select one answer. Thank you. Arianna, I think we could close that now. Have we got the results of the poll?
Is that visible for everybody?
I can't see them, no.
You can't see it? Arianna, can you put it on? We should probably say this is a new tool. We just got that recently, so we are still a bit experimenting with it.
Michael, you need to look under polls and then closed.
Yeah, I can see it, but it should be shown also to the participants.
Yeah, they should see it on the screen. Yeah.
Exactly.
You just need to look at the polls and then
Yeah,
under the
it.
closed session, and you can see all the results.
Gotcha. Okay. Oops. So if everybody can see it.
So it's interesting, for most people, it's either restructuring their programs or using ECTS, and then very low down is anything around governance, nothing about no impact on social inclusion, even as a framework, or student-centered learning. Yeah, thank you.
It would be interesting on whether this has really had so little impact, or on whether what has been brought forward there has not been flagged as Bologna activities. It's a bit like what Marita said in the Swedish system, probably, that some things you had already in place, others came in. We know that from some country that it has not been particularly flagged as Bologna achievements. So it could be both. But indeed, it's kind of telling that social inclusion is so low, and also the participatory approach, the role of students and staff is also not mentioned. Okay.
I think that the immense work done in restructuring to the 3 cycle actually labeled Bologna process, so that is in people's minds, and of course it's been important, but and also redoing all the curriculum with doubling descriptor like descriptions was also a major work. So I think a lot is done at the national level at social inclusion, but maybe it's not labeled as Bologna process. Thanks.
Can you remind me where we see the summaries of the questions that people have answered?
So under the polls in the closed session, you see the results. Then if you want to go with the second questions, then we can open the poll again.
No, but where did we see the summary of the chat questions that people have posed?
Ella, it's under Q&A. Right. Next to chat, Q&A, and you look after published.
Right. It just didn't seem to be. Oh, yeah, I've got it. Right. Thank you. There just weren't many questions. That was all. I don't know if people have got any further questions. That we had some things about the 3rd cycle. Yes, actually, one question, a very obvious but important question that someone's raised is, how will the changing circumstances affect some of the core aspects of Bologna, in particular staff and student mobility? Now that's virtual, how will we respond to adapt to that? And several people were asking that. Any views from the speakers?
I would say that this has created an enormous creativity in new ways of being together. And so actually, I think in the long run, this pandemic situation with the necessary online togetherness will create a much more flexibility in the way we are together. And maybe we need to look at our instruments to see how they will support the new ways that will be developed. And so of course, it has been hampering in the short term mobility, since we have not been able to travel. But when in the long term, I think we will actually benefit from these experiences that we have.
I mean, there's a question, isn't there?
And we
as to-
Could
Sorry,
I just on
Miguel.
the same issue? I think as it is asked now how the Bologna process would reflect on it, I think at the moment there is no particular reflection on that. But this is clearly something that deserves also a discussion with the sector, because otherwise the Bologna process can't know what is there anything to do about it. And I think that's the situation currently. We know that the opportunities of virtual mobility have been out for a long period of time, but nobody has really used them. This is what Marita also said. It's we have become very creative now, and we use them. A question is still also, I mean, you can feel that behind this forced shift to digital, online, virtual exchanges, there is an ardent desire to go back to the real world and have the physical thing. And I'm also not sure, that's probably a question for Peter and Marita, to what extent institutions are already prepared now to buy into this, providing digital Erasmuses, for example. I think in the current situation, what we see also is that students probably still hope to get it physically. And also, while digital Erasmus is somehow recognized, they wouldn't get a scholarship for that. So that's not really an incentive. But I agree in principle that it will make things much more. We have all become much more flexible in general.
Yeah, and I think there, if I may add to that, there is a question of different speeds. I think with the initial phase of the Bologna process, this has been the leading organization in Europe, and now we, of course, have many more developments that go extremely quickly, that are organized initially at institutional level, but are building on lots of expertise that has been gathered and brought together in the last couple of years, project-wise, in pilots, in small changes. And it turns out that we now are ready to really do completely different things. And this is what is creating lots of opportunity. However, we should, I think, not make the mistake in a post-COVID era to just go back to normal, meaning mainstreaming physical mobility, because the tools that we now have at hand were initially developed to complement physical mobility, so that we could, with the sum of the two, reach a goal which has been called mobility for all, internationalization for every student, and so on. So I think what we are now realizing with all universities in Europe and actually globally is really something very, very something that should render us very optimistic about collaboration at the European scale, because the combination of all these instruments, semester mobility, virtual mobility, but also the vast amount of new initiatives on short mobilities, all together will probably realize much more than the initial 20% goal of internationalization for our student body. So let's work on that. And I think working together to realize this is something that at the ministerial level should be taken up.
And make sure that it doesn't have the same problems of lack of social inclusion as the real mobility had. I think that's really important. I wonder now if we could go to the next poll.
Just add one thing, because just to add that there's a concrete reference to virtual mobility in view of the COVID developments in the next communique. So that's already mentioned there. It is also made clear that this is not really to replace physical mobility. It does that in this particular crisis, but we should really, as Peter said, cultivate it as an additional means for exchange and in particular for internationalization, so that every student gets an international experience.
Thank you. Arianna, could we now go to the second live poll? Thank you. Which is about the future, trying to think how you would like to see the Bologna process developing. You can select, more than one answer. Okay, I think that's long enough, Ariane. I mean, those results are pretty split between the different things. I mean, I think, interestingly, you know, social inclusion features as an aspiration now for the future, as does participative governance. So what we can learn about governance across the partnership. But also, again, as the speakers mentioned, there's still a commitment to the essentials of the Bologna process. So really making the 3-cycle work and ensuring good quality, and actually having a system where other countries recognize qualifications. They're still very, very important, despite the difference in emphasis that there is. Is there any views from the speakers on those?
Yeah, Ella, if I may, it's only by 1%, but the recognition of qualifications and study abroad periods is highest on the list. I think this really is something quite important. So when we try to collaborate together across institutional levels, but also when we want to recognize degrees and qualifications of other instances, I think we are still facing too many barriers. So I mentioned in my introduction the strive for European degrees, work that needs to be done into that direction. And there I think alignment of the viewpoints among the 48 members of the European higher education area could be quite instrumental. Although we should be very careful in what we are wishing for. Actually, we are looking for simple instruments at the EU level that or at EHEA level to facilitate European degree, not additional red tape. I think this is quite important. We should try to simplify the work that we all want to do together, and not come up with very complex new institutions with other schemes of evaluation and what have you. So that, but that I think is a challenge that should be taken up in the future. And well, this Bologna process is well suited to work on that.
Yeah,
I agree. And I also would like to come back to what you said, Peter, before, that the European Universities Initiative could be an instrument for all, not only the institutions that are members of such an alliances. If we use it wisely, that could explore the systemic cooperation, and could be really helpful to detect and overcoming obstacles for cooperation and transnational cooperation. And that is already in the communique. And I think that is could be an instrument for another Bologna. Some wise person said this can be Bologna 3.0, and we'll see if we can make it happen.
Yeah, I think I talked about unfinished business. You know, I think we all become aware now that it's all unfinished business, because things change, you know, and that's true for recognition, quality assurance. I think where we have a very solid basis, but where from time to time we will have to assess on whether that actually fits. Just recently, the E4, so ENQA, EURASHE, I mentioned it now, I had mentioned it before, it was just not on my slide. EURASHE, ESU, and the EUA have brought out a commentary to the standards and guidelines, which basically makes the point that they also extend to digitally enhanced learning, so blended online learning. And I think that's an important achievement. There have been years of discussion whether you needed special QA for that. I mentioned that also because there were several comments on QA approaches in the questions before. And probably also a point now, the short cycle was mentioned, that has been brought into the qualifications framework now, which I think is a good achievement. Not all countries have short cycles, but those who have them can be sure that this will be recognized also in other countries. And probably to mention that also in the upcoming communique, you will find a reference also on shorter periods of learning, or shorter units of learning, such as micro-credentials. We have seen that that's also very much emphasized by the European Commission at the moment. And we are not quite sure in what direction it goes, but I think that there the Bologna Forum, the Bologna process is really a good forum, a good way of enabling that developments in the different countries at institutional and national levels are taken into consideration in a discussion that on these issues that makes it much richer, to ensure that we find solutions that later on work for all countries.
Thank you. I'm in a minute just going to ask people for their concluding remarks, but maybe I could just make an observation that as we've seen in the poll, particular aspects of Bologna are important for different institutions. Speaking from the UK, I'd just like to say that Bologna, actually as a process, is even more important for the UK, as it's one of the ways that we can remain closely involved in international and European HE. And of course, leaving the EU doesn't affect our position in the Bologna process, thankfully. But I think this is an internal point really about the UK. I think it's important that we continue to emphasize the value that framework brings to universities. And it's linked to a point that came up a little bit in your discussions, that often Bologna influences national systems and the work of HE without people realizing that influence does come from Bologna. And you ask yourself, does that matter or not? In the case of the UK at the moment, I think it does. So could I turn to my colleagues to see if they have any concluding remarks?
Well, I could start. I just want to remind us that we are in different degrees living the Bologna process, although we don't know it or not, in Europe, and this is regarded as for some as a process of being competitive in the world, but it's also, and perhaps foremost, a peace process, and that we need to continue to work on it, and we need to continue to do it in the national context. Each country needs to have processes for the main parts of the Bologna process, as well as we need to work together, perhaps more important than ever before. So I hope that the Bologna process, although named Bologna or not, that we will sit here in another 10 years and discuss the big step that has been taken, and the important things that we've done together at the national level and together.
Yeah, maybe just one reflection. I think we have all benefited a lot from the Bologna process, and to attribute changes to the Bologna process or not, I don't think is the right question, because of course there has also been input of all of us in the Bologna process. So it has been a co-creative, I think, enterprise of European education, and that has been a good thing to work together. I would like to emphasize again that maybe next steps are needed but we should not try to come up with new ambitions. I think to realizing fully all the ambitions that we have put forward before is the most crucial aspect, and reinforcing each other's initiatives and creativity. I think this is what we need to do with lots of emphasis on the people that really are at stake here, and that's the people who organize day-to-day education at our institutions. They are the ones that matter, and they have to do the work.
Thank you. Marita?
Yeah, just a couple of words from me. I think there's not much what I would not agree to, and maybe the next time we should invite speakers who are more critical about the Bologna process. We will be accused of making it more beautiful than it probably is. But I'm honestly quite relieved to hear that, and I think we have probably had quite a journey from the protests that we have seen, and also the challenges that many institutions have experienced. Let's say a couple of years ago when reforms came in top down. I heard recently from a colleague from one of the Nordic universities who told me, you can't mention learning outcomes here, you know, it's still burned because it has been introduced overnight and nobody likes it. Yeah, so that this is gone, and we get really to very constructive collaboration on these issues across countries, between governments and the sector, because that is really what is needed. And several of the things that have been flagged here, and there was much more in the questions, are really also open issues where we don't know really in what direction it goes, and it's not particularly helpful to look what we have sometimes done in the past, to look across the Atlantic and say the US does this. We know now from experience that it might not necessarily know that it works for us. It might not even work for the US in the end, you know, but rather to try to find out what are the issues that should be taken up in the next round. And I think this is how we are approaching now the issue of shorter units of learning, aka micro-credentials, yeah, which are already in spread at many institutions, but does need something from the Bologna process. We are working on a study on that, yeah. Okay. Or is that just something that institutions should do? I think that's always the question, you know. It's like Peter said, you know, keep it light, don't over-regulate, and leave enough room for the institutions.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it's time to wrap up now. Sorry, Marita, I didn't have time to get to you. Can I thank our presenters for giving very incisive views about the Bologna process, and also the backup staff who've helped with the technology. Can I just announce that the next webinar is on internationalization and mobility on the 13th of the 10th. Thankfully, I'll just be an attendee at that. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.